I'm always getting very passionate about the topic of asset recovery. As you might recall from the introduction of my matter with PhD student, understanding how asset recovery was used very successfully by the Italian law enforcement in the fight against the mafia. But of course, moving very quickly to the issues here at hand, which are much more continental and maybe even at home here in Nigeria. I've been, coincidentally maybe, my very first trip to Nigeria in April 2000 was actually under the heading, so to speak, of asset recovery. I remember at that time meeting Peter Ghana, who was heading the task force on the very first Abacha case, and having long conversations with him, going through the various lists of the transactions that he was tracing across the globe of the Abacha and family. And all of that conversation took place basically literally in a private house inside the presidency, and essentially involved him. Fast forward, so to speak, 2023, when you want to have a conversation around asset recovery with the relevant Nigerian government counterparts, you would struggle to put them all in a massive meeting hall. You have, of course, in the Ministry of Justice, the Asset Recovery and Management Unit, you have dedicated departments in EFCC and ICPC. NDLEA has just set up itself, others are following. And so if we just want to measure in terms of institutional capacities that African nations, and of course here I'm very much referring to Nigeria as sort of the prime example, and frankly speaking, I think the world champion in asset recovery, I think, which is often not actually maybe emphasized enough of how much Nigeria has actually achieved for itself, of course, but also on behalf of the continent by pushing basically this agenda forward with its very, very remarkable capabilities. So I think there is certainly a glass half full. At least I would like to think about it in that way. I've also seen in other African countries, most notably, I had quite a bit of cooperation with Tanzania around asset recovery when I was with the STAR initiative. And I was really impressed of how they took the very impressive lessons, including from Nigeria, to at a much smaller scale, maybe also. I mean, not surprisingly, the economy and everything is just a bit smaller, but very effectively in setting up their own asset recovery outfit inside the Department of the Prosecutor General. So there has been quite some progress, and it's been, I think, really interesting, both as part of UNODC as well as at this Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, to be somewhat accompanying that progress, these achievements, supporting them at technical level to the extent that we can, and helping really through a variety of interventions, whether it's legislative drafting, standard operating procedures, helping with case consultations between the countries that are seeking recovery and those where the assets are suspected to be located or have been confirmed to be located. The issue, very important issue of management and disposal of assets, both domestically as well as, of course, in the context of international asset recovery cases. The very critical point of mutual legal assistance and central authorities, which I think I've not heard so explicitly mentioned so far, but maybe it's been mentioned and I just missed it. And of course, a lot of sort of tools, mentoring services, and institutional development and training of judges and prosecutors that are involved in these cases, in particular around the domestic issues, actually, which of course then have implications for potential mutual legal assistance, because one of the things that we have realized that very often the applications in asset recovery cases, and there it gets very technical, are not always drafted in the smartest way, if I can say so. And that then often basically either leads to very inefficient management of assets or actually destruction of assets in the course of the management of these assets, because they are not been asked for the right powers, basically right from the beginning to the respective courts in terms of the powers that are required in order to manage an asset in an economically viable form. Now, to come to the issues that you mentioned at the beginning, Professor Ladan, as sort of like the key questions that you like to this conversation to address. On the skill problem, I think, as I already said, massive progress has been made. Of course, the progress is not equal in all African countries, and I have also been involved in the STAR initiative in the attempts to support asset recovery initiatives that have failed. And I will not mention the countries now, but where clearly, for reasons that I probably don't fully understand, essentially we were woefully unsuccessful actually in pursuing the attempt. Having said that, I think one of the immense opportunities that I see at this moment, and somehow the seminar de facto is one such opportunities, is really for the learning from each other, the South-South cooperation. I really think at this stage, Nigeria actually has pretty much all the capabilities, has learned all the techniques, has massively experienced people working on asset recovery cases that can actually provide other countries in Africa with that necessary support, technically speaking, but also politically speaking, to pursue their own, to build their own cases in asset recovery. And that, I think, is something that I think we could pursue a little bit more strongly. It's something really Nigeria can offer the rest of Africa. And I think where also we as the UN and the African Union can maybe play a more active role, Jabba as well, in facilitating that kind of assistance. And I'm really thinking here more beyond basically just the seminars, the exchange of experiences, but much more hands-on kind of like support, because that's really what it is about. You don't learn asset recovery in the hall of a university. You learn asset recovery by doing asset recovery. That, I think, is not forgetting that in the absolute majority of cases, any even seasoned prosecutor will have maybe 2 or 3 significant cases in their entire professional career. So thinking that you can learn something that you then at some point start to implement, I think is not the right approach, especially when we talk about complex international cases. There will be 1 or 2 in your lifespan, and you are learning on the job by resolving the problems as they are basically presenting themselves. The issue of the trust deficit, I think here we have really immense opportunities. And I think, first and foremost, I think we have made quite some strides. We should really, I love the expression, the Nigerian expression of clap for yourself, which I really, I think applies in this case. The trust deficit, no doubt, it has been there, and it certainly still continues to exist to some extent, but also we have really chipped away at this issue. Most notably, I think, for example, the Global Asset Recovery Forum, the Global Forum on Asset Recovery, which will actually meet again in not in Washington, sorry, in Atlanta, on the margins of the upcoming Conference of State Parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption. So again, there will be a reiteration, so to speak, of that global forum. And just to recall, in I think it was the 2016 forum, that was critical in actually finalizing the deal between Switzerland, the World Bank, and Nigeria for the return of Abacha 2, the 324 million US dollars. And it was really that platform which created the space that and a clear target in time at which we wanted all, whether STAR, whether Nigeria, whether the Swiss or the hosts, wanted really something to show to the world that this were not just nice words, but that there were concrete actions. And because we had that target date, I think everybody had sort of a unified sense of a common purpose, that any issues that were maybe standing in the way of finding a final agreement on this return would have to be resolved by the time of the forum. And I think with the next forum coming up, we have another opportunity to use that forum exactly in that kind of with that kind of spirit and that kind of a clear sense of purpose. On the issue, of course, then there's the question of well, what are the destination countries, the financial centers, are they doing? And I increasingly think, well, you know, I find it increasingly hard, I honestly have to admit, of identifying the financial centers quite as clearly as it used to be the case. You know, we had sort of like the offshore, the financial safe havens 10, 15 years ago as sort of like the principal destination, it seemed. I don't see that anymore so clearly. I think we need to broaden our perspective. If I look at, for example, the list of countries that Nigeria at the present has ongoing conversations around asset recovery, none of them would strike me as you know, a financial safe haven in the classical sense. I mean, we're talking about jurisdictions in the political north, whether it's the US, France, you know, others that are not necessarily secrecy jurisdiction, but they are basically full-fledged financial centers where people like anyone, legitimate or illegitimate, like to park their money. And I think the conversation of whether they are doing enough to, on their side, to cooperate in asset recovery is, I think, a very legitimate question. I think it's a question that I think we need to become more inquisitive about. And I'm particularly intrigued by the opportunities that lend themselves by a more detailed study of the country reports on these kind of jurisdictions and see what have they actually done. And I don't mean so much the laws, because it's very easy to put a law in place. If you don't use the law, it has no effect, obviously. So I think we need to start to look a little bit beyond the question of legal compliance to the question of, well, have you actually used the law once, twice? How many cases did you actually have of cooperation? And does it work in practice, so to speak? Because I think the reality may be that, you know, with a few exceptions of jurisdictions that have actually returned and continue to return quite significant amounts of money, we do not see that as a generic trend across basically all the potential financial centers where monies are potentially kept. The issue of relooting, I think, is overstated, and I think African countries should actually push back on this. I think the only weak spot in pushing back that I can see is these challenges that you have with accounting. And the fact that you cannot account necessarily, for the use of whichever return, doesn't mean automatically that monies have been stolen, but that is often like, I think how it is a little bit interpreted or convoluted. And I think one needs to push back, but of course, it requires at the same time that we get our own houses in order, so to speak. I'm speaking now as a son of Nigeria, so to speak, at least an adopted son. But I think we need to do better on this. Finally, and that of course requires two things, I think, to happen. One is having a domestic system for asset recovery that applies both for domestically recovered assets and internationally recovered assets. It makes no sense for you to have two systems in parallel, and that in itself creates a lot of, I think, confusion. So having one system that is clearly transparent, having a system, I think there's a big question mark at the moment. Should assets go back into the general budget and follow the established process, the established budgetary process? And I think there's a lot of good arguments to pursue that approach. I think the only weakness in it is basically that it prevents you from being then able to account for the exact use of that money. Because if you put the whatever 500 million that you recovered back into the national budget, they of course are being used in accordance with the big budget, and you could then say, I don't know, 1% of the entire national budget was basically financed from asset recovery, but where exactly it went is difficult to trace. And that is the big disadvantage, is obviously that you have an established process with accountabilities, auditing rules, political controls. So all of that seems to be in place. But the problem is, how do you account then? And that, of course, I think becomes very important for your international partners that want to have that assurance, rightly or wrongly, but that is the reality. They want that assurance that the money that they can later go back and say, okay, the money has been used for the Niger Bridge, for the Ibadan-Kano highway, or the like. And I know my colleagues from Clean and Anish are gonna certainly talk about their very interesting experiences about providing exactly that transparency a little bit later on. So essentially, I think progress has been considerable. Progress has, of course, been very uneven across different African countries, and we can benefit much more from learning from each other and supporting each other in very practical ways. We need still to use these platforms provided by STAR and others, ICAR and so on. We need to use these platforms to continue building trust, but also exercise political pressure, if you want to say so. I think the upcoming Conference of State Parties and the Global Forum on Asset Recovery that will be hosted by the US government together with the UK and France, I believe, will provide just one more opportunity, so to speak, for countries to push the agenda, so to speak, in this regard. And yeah, I'm very much continue to look forward to support that process, including, of course, in Nigeria. I should not forget to mention that. The Proceeds of Crime Act, of course, a huge achievement, legislatively speaking, and we are really gearing up, so to speak, trying to work with all the international development partners. I'm very glad that Mrs. Washington joined this conversation as well, to see to what extent we can help both the Ministry of Justice, but also all the other relevant agencies that are mentioned in the Proceeds of Crime Act in building the necessary tools and capabilities to actually give effective implementation to it. Keywords are, for example, the question of a central database. Again, a key element to the issue of transparency. Of course, capacity building, potentially a regulation to deal with some of the ambiguities or gaps in the POCA standard operating procedures, where I think we can immensely learn. You know, EFCC has been doing this for donkey years. Why reinventing the wheel? Let's learn from them, take how they have been going about this, and others, ICPC as well, in effectively recovering and managing assets. And I think also very importantly, a greater scrutiny on those that are being employed to manage complex assets on behalf of law enforcement. I think you are quite familiar that many of the, let's say, assets like hotels, businesses, and so on, they're not being managed by the EFCCs themselves, but they're being managed through essentially outside help, commercial people, and that is absolutely okay and actually desirable, and I think it's the model that most countries pursue. However, you need to have a certification process for that. You need to have a certain quality assurance basically for that kind of service. I have already got